I also think that being a one-man show is not useful. So,
And we're back. Blacklights podcast live on air. It's your girl, Lachey Boone-McCrae. I'm here with my boy,
Dion Walcott, here to rock and roll, get to this Blacklights podcast.
Yeah. And we have a special guest. We have Anya Ayoung Chee, fashion designer and advocate for social change through fashion. We're so happy to have you. Welcome.
thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, super dope.
Well, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and we have that in common,
Yes,
Dion and I.
yes.
I was born in New York, grew up in Trinidad, and wanted, I think, from a very young age to like express myself through clothes. And I was just one of those kids, like sort of typical, like I would rip up everything and put it back together. And but by the time I was choosing subjects, as they call it, in secondary school, there was no room really for being a designer. That was not something that was a profession that anybody exposed me to. And so I ended up choosing biology and chemistry, and I did do arts, but my father was a surgeon. It was like I was good enough in the sciences.
Yeah.
It's like it's obvious in the Caribbean context that you're gonna study medicine, you know. But I fought to study arts in the midst of all that, and I think that was an early indication that like I was gonna follow a different path at some point. I ended up going to design school. I went to Parsons in New York.
Okay.
But in the first 6 months, I was so homesick. I was desperate to be able to go back home, and I finished my degree. And so I kind of chickened out, and I did graphic design instead, because
Okay.
I knew a lot more graphic designers who had jobs.
Yeah, right.
Right? Like
Yeah.
than fashion designers. But soon after I graduated, one of my brothers, I have 5 brothers, I'm the first of 6, and he died in a really tragic car accident in 2006, and it just changed my whole life. You know, I went back home. I was living in New York. I just had to be with my family, and I just spent like a good year like in exploration. You know, I entered the Miss Trinidad and Tobago Miss Universe pageants. I was Miss Trinidad and Tobago at Miss Universe in 2008.
Shout out to you. Oh my goodness. I didn't know that.
And the pageant was in Vietnam.
Okay.
And I stayed on afterwards for a month and ended up in those little tailoring shops where, you know, you choose your fabrics and you get something the next day, like made for you,
Yeah.
you know. And that was really fascinating because it suddenly hit me that, like, I was kind of a natural at figuring out, like, silhouettes and particularly prints, you know, and I basically ended up unintentionally doing all the prototypes for what became my first collection. And I went back home to Trinidad. I asked the, you know, sort of most established fashion designer there, Mei Ling, to mentor me. And I just took a gigantic leap, you know, and I just said, listen, like, my brother died at 18, I was 25. I can't just live my life halfway anymore. Like, it just wasn't good enough, you know. I had to do it on behalf of him and for myself. And so I just decided I'm gonna just dive into what I always wanted to do without any formal experience. I really didn't know how to sew. I still don't. But anyway, I had an eye, you know. So I launched my first collection. Of course, I named it after him, Pilar, and it was a gigantic hit. Like, I was already still Miss Trinidad and Tobago, so I had this platform, and I really leveraged it to showcase my line. But then a year later, I had a really public sex tape scandal, which was definitely not intentional.
Yeah.
It was a true violation of my privacy, but it kind of like decimated all of the progress that happened the year before.
Yeah.
And so I went into a deep kind of self-exploration. I was seethingly angry for about a year, but then I kind of like found a way to own the experience, and I learned how to be truly accountable, and that again changed my life. And so I don't know, in that process, I was sort of, again, open to whatever possibilities. And I saw a tweet one day, this is 2009, 2010, for applications to Project Runway. And I looked at the application, I was like, fuck it, like, what I can't lose, you know? I literally could fill out everything except for the fact that I couldn't sew.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, well, I'll just, you know, they're never going to get back to me anyway. So what's the harm?
Shoot my shot.
2 days later, they called me. And I was like, what? Like, I can't,
real?
no. Like,
Yeah.
So then I went to the audition. I took what I designed, but not necessarily sewn. So it was a little bit of a, you know. But yeah, then eventually when they called me and said, okay, you're cast, I was like, no, I can't come. Like, I can't sew. Like, I couldn't tell them that. But they're like, no, you don't understand. You're a cast. You have to come, you know. So I showed up. It was an adventure. I was like, if I get kicked off the first episode, it's a story to tell. One episode turned to another episode. And
So
then
what did you do? I mean, I watched it, but what did you, like, for people to know, what did you do? Like, how did you overcome it?
when they called me to say you're cast, it was 2 weeks out,
Yeah.
right? So I called my seamstress who made my line, and I was like, you need to teach me whatever you can, anything, you know? So we kind of like had access to the fashion design school in Trinidad in the after hours, and she just took me there for like, 10-hour stretches for 2 straight weeks, and I just learned to pattern. I learned how to stitch on an industrial machine, from scratch.
Yeah.
And if you watch the first episode, you see that the camera sat with me for like 4 hours while I tried to thread this machine, because I still didn't really know what I was doing.
Right,
you know?
right.
But I don't know. There was a side of me in that whole period where I was like, this is not about anything other than being in gratitude for being here. I was so grateful for the opportunity. It really didn't matter to me what happened. And I do think that had a huge influence on how far along I got. So when I won, it was like
You weren't even
incredible trajectory.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. So then after Runway, that was like, the exposure, the fact that I was Trini in this, American competition, it had a gigantic influence on the creative industries in the Caribbean and, well, in Trinidad in particular. When somebody from an island does anything on a world stage, it's like, it's a shared collective celebration.
You won for the whole country.
Yeah, man, it was like the World Cup, it was like huge because of the context, So I think from that perspective, like, it's sort of like my life before Project Runway and my life after.
Yeah.
And then after, I sort of used it for so many different, to your point about advocacy through fashion, like, that's really what the rest of my career has become.
Okay.
My own lines, yes, but leveraging of opportunities for more creatives and entrepreneurs, small businesses in general. I've built 2 organizations since that support both of these things.
Yeah.
And my life has become a merging of building community, creating impact, and offering opportunity and access to more people.
What are the name of the organizations?
One is called Nudge Caribbean. That one supports 200 entrepreneurs across 3 islands, St. Lucia, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, who are, MSMEs, and bridging between where they are and where they need to be, mostly through market access, because a lot of that is what evades small businesses. And then the other is called Spool, where we train women who are from at-risk backgrounds how to produce for the fashion and carnival industries. And that was really born out of my advocacy for anti-gender-based violence and recognizing that female economic empowerment is really the most effective way to support women in situations like that. So to date, we've trained 94 women, both from a Venezuelan background and a Trinidadian background, how to produce in the fashion and carnival industry. Carnival is a huge industry, and a lot of that production has become exported. So it's a twofold thing, because we don't have a lot of production infrastructure in Trinidad, and yet tons of talent. So I'm trying to bridge that gap too, based on my own experience of when I first started. Like, I had to run around the country to get seamstresses to make things, and it's just totally inefficient, So now we have like a dedicated small batch production space, hiring the women who have graduated from the program, so bridging between the impact and the industry, and that's been a really powerful merging of my different skill sets and experience.
So dope.
I think one of the things that's always impressive when we connect is, and a lot of people don't understand this, is like being Caribbean and then also coming to the U.S., it's almost a form of code switching.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's 2 totally different cultures.
Yeah.
People don't realize that because they don't get to spend a lot of time in the Caribbean, right? But that being said, being a woman, one that has to go back and forth, where the present state of like the fashion industry is right now, what would you say, like, how could they improve representation?
I mean, it's an incredibly important moment, I think, particularly coming out of being at this forum and hearing the different types of voices that are, yes, American, but almost always have some immigrant relationship, right? Whether that's the Caribbean, it's Africa, it's, even just yesterday you're hearing people like shouting out when they're either Nigerian, Ghanaian, Jamaican, whatever, and so there's always this subcontext of being either African American or American in some way, but really you're from somewhere else.
Somewhere else, right.
Yeah.
So this is not just a Caribbean experience, it's a shared experience. And I was, Dion, you introduced me to Cherise Thornhill, which gave me the opportunity to work on an Adidas Seed collaboration that was about Carnival.
Right.
And that was probably the biggest expression of storytelling in a big way with a big brand,
Yes,
but
for sure.
extremely authentically.
Right.
And that doesn't happen a lot, right? And there's that, I think, is what really needs to happen. Like when Ludlow yesterday from Bacardi spoke about this, he's saying like you have to force the culture.
You
Yeah.
do.
You have
you
to
do.
force it.
And you have to sneak. There's sneak ways, which is the sneaker. You're telling it through
Yeah.
the product.
Totally. But sometimes, like even in that project, the product development was authentically developed, but then the marketing and the storytelling fell short.
Right.
So if you don't
Right.
have someone representing at every step of the
Yes.
journey, then it almost, I mean, it's always a good step,
Right.
but you really do have to have somebody at the table throughout.
The whole
you know,
way through.
The merchandisers, the marketers, the, you know, everybody who's on the salespeople. Like,
Right.
if they don't know the story, how are they going to sell the product, you know?
Yeah, I get it.
And if you also don't let people who know the story truthfully, like you think about people's impression of the Caribbean, so much of it has to do with tourism, product, a little bit of surface around like Bob Marley and reggae, and, you know, like
Yeah.
that's all anybody thinks about, right?
They
And
don't go
that's
deeper at all.
right, and like that's not the full story.
Yeah, not at
know?
all.
So I've tried to use my lines, my clothing lines in particular, to storytell from the root, you know. And like for instance, my first Pilar collection was inspired by the Boba Shanti, which are a very specific sect of Rastafari, who look incredible, like head to toe, you know.
Right.
They're just so stylish, like innately, you know. And so I use that to kind of, and I didn't really do it intentionally, but that's my lived experience. I see them every single day walking up down the highway selling nuts and just looking fresh, you know.
Right.
Like they press out their pants, like they can't have one crease on their pants, you know. And that's part of their religion. They don't do it to be stylish,
Right,
you know. But so if you storytell from that perspective and you have people at the table who could tell those stories authentically, because that's their whole life,
That's
you
how
know.
they live every single
That's
day.
what you live every single day. Like you can't lose.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's the thorough representation throughout the entire process of a product life cycle that is important.
That's important.
Yeah.
Lachey.
Yeah, so one of the things that you touched on earlier was, and we've been talking about it a lot, mentorship.
Right.
So you said, you know, you went back home, you shot your shot, and, you know, hit up Ming Lee. So how did that even, like, you know, happen? And then what has mentorship, you know, meant to you over time? And are you a mentor?
I would not be here if it weren't for the women in particular who said yes to my, you know, request to show up for me in ways that would have, mentorship has bridged the gap and closed the timeline on certain things. I've sort of made it much more efficient to step into the world of fashion without having a lot of formal experience because of like leveraging what they knew. Otherwise, how much longer would it have taken for me to figure out like what choices and what decisions do I make every step of the way, and they would clear spaces for me, you know, which I think when I think back on it now, there's no way I would be here without that. And I do make every effort I can to give back in kind, right? Like I think the small things, you don't even have to mentor somebody formally to have an impact on their life, even just by making one introduction, sending one email, opening one door. What I tend to do a lot is I think of people when I see opportunities, and then I make sure that they're given that chance, you know, even if they haven't reached out to me, because sometimes it's scary, right? Like there's a perception that someone is somehow unreachable, unattainable, and that's really not, I mean, I don't respond to messages, but that's not because I'm not unreachable. It's just that, you know, I have 2 kids and whatever. But yeah, no, I really make an effort, knowing what a gigantic undescribable really benefit I had to have mentorship. But there was something in asking, because I wouldn't have if I didn't put myself out there. And being strategic too about who I asked, because at different times in my life there've been more business mentorship, sometimes more design, sometimes more even outside of any of those things. When I became more of an advocate, I had to learn how to be an activist. Like that's not something you just know how to do, you know. And I felt the most imposter syndrome I've ever felt, because you have to, like, people have to believe you that you care about these things, you know. So in every section, and I think because I've been kind of multi-hyphenate in my career, I've had to do it many times. I've stepped into so many new spaces where I wasn't technically supposed to be there. Even over the last 5 years, I've partnered with the Caribbean's largest conglomerates, which is called Massey, to develop Nudge Caribbean, which is the organization that supports MSMEs. And it put me in corporate boardrooms for the last 5 years. That was a real code switching experience for me. Like, I didn't know how to do that, you know. How do I dress like this in a boardroom, you know? And it took me 5 years to return to myself in the boardroom, still be me, you know, because I did all this shifting, like how I wrote emails, how I'd show up on calls, everything started to change. And I was like, why the fuck am I doing this?
You're losing yourself. So I get it.
You know? But that sort of corporate experience has changed the way I now do business for myself, you know. So I think all of those are examples of mentorship, even if they don't always mean that, like, oh, I want you to be my mentor. You know, they're mentorship moments too. But we built a mentorship program, an executive coaching mentorship program, into our Nudge Caribbean programming, because I think people need to even understand the value of it before they even ask for it, you know. So anyway, my point is I thoroughly believe in it. Somebody mentioned on stage yesterday about sponsorship versus mentorship, and I definitely think that there's an overemphasis on mentorship and not enough on sponsorship. And that's an access thing too, right? Like, I think there are people who go to business school and have Ivy League degrees, and sponsorship is a given. Not as much for the rest of us, you know. So I think it's having, even first, the clarity as to what the difference is between the two. Second, the access to the people who would sponsor you. And then of course asking for it. So yeah, all of the above.
You just noted that Dion had connected you with Sharice Thornhill, right? And so to me, that's sponsorship, right? Like, who's saying my name in a room? So shout out to you, D, because I think that's a wonderful connection. And shout out to Sharice, because we love Sharice and what she's doing in reference to the SEED program. So how did that conversation go as far as, like, even that collaboration with SEED?
He plucked me out. Like, we didn't know each other.
Okay.
He cold reached out to me, you know, for Yellow Brick, right? And that started our relationship, and then he took me to the farm in Bushwick, and it was right before the pandemic. It was a crucial introduction, because 3 years later, Sharice called me out of the blue. She's like, let's do this carnival thing. And I was like, let's do it. Like,
but 3 years later, though.
3
like,
years
you know,
later.
that's what I'm saying. Like, even just, and I always call you the plug, brother. I'm like, that's the plug.
Sure.
But, but even just as far as even planting that seed, and then just what can definitely come out of fruition, right?
1,000%. And now, I mean, we're friends, right? And we're talking about what comes next, and we're talking about how to build on that authentic story between Adidas and the Caribbean. And now it's like, it's in the door, you know, like as somebody said yesterday, if the door opens, take the hinges off. I think Dwayne said that, right? Like, it's not good enough to just get the one chance. It's really the strategy to keep in it, you know, and then leave that door open for everybody else to pass through. I think we're still at that stage where the doors are still being opened. They're not open, you know. And I think about my work all the time, like being way outside of me, because I got to open several doors for myself, but I'm just trying to keep them like that, you know, because it's too much work to do it over and over again. Like, why do you want to leave? You know what I mean? So, but Sharice, it's a constant evolution of the ways in which she, in her position, can leverage because she's Trinidadian too, right? And in positions like that, like, you have the influence, but there's so many moving parts, and to sort of support her in how do we just keep telling the story, but in more and more ways, and all the way through to the end of the life cycle of a product. And so I'm excited for what comes next there. Both her and Jessica have influenced me and inspired me so much with the work that they do with Seed, and that has influenced how I've designed the work we do with Nudge. So it's many, many layers. It's not just the Adidas collaboration. It's really also like learning best practice as it pertains to education and the future of education. I think what they've done is incredible. And I'm consistently figuring out how to apply that in the Caribbean too. And in fact, I think we've been talking about that too, like building pipelines into the US for Caribbean talent.
I want to touch back on that, but I feel there's something you said earlier that I want you to double down on a little bit. Because I'm always in the position of working with creatives. I'm the behind the scenes guy. You had an experience where you're a creative on the left, but then now you have to be a businesswoman on the right, right? What's the challenges that you went through there? Because, like, a lot of people don't get that experience. Usually it's a Dion that's handling all your stuff. But, like, you actually can play on both sides. What's some of the challenges? Just so people understand, it's not that easy.
It's not easy, and we're in a world where creativity in business is one of the most important skill sets to have.
Of course, yes.
The way in which the economies have changed, the needs of consumers, there's no straight path anymore. When I think about fashion, when I first started doing it, there were seasonal, very specific ways that you showed a collection, specific ways you attempted to get into a retail,
Store,
distribution. Now it's like technology has disrupted all of that, right? And the needs of the consumer have disrupted that. And so I think being creative about how you reach your customer is something. It's really a reapplication of your creativity, just in terms of like how do you get your product to market, you know? I also think that being a one-man show is not useful. So having the Dions is also crucial, but you have to know your own business.
Right.
And if you have the expertise to support you in that, that's extra. Like, that's really how it should be. But to make the core decisions, to know where you want to go, I think I'm learning now more than ever how to be strategic more than anything else. I think it's one thing to do good business. That's a skill unto itself. It's another thing to really know what you're trying to achieve and build a clear path towards that, and know that this is based on the market information. You're not just Kendall Miles said this yesterday. She's like, know what the market needs before you go off and make it.
Exactly.
If women don't want to wear foreign heels, don't make foreign heels.
Right.
It's like so simple and so smart. And I think that's where, as creative people, we get to put the sort of emotional attachment to ideas aside. Because you know what you realize over time, and maybe I've learned this by doing, is you lose touch with the connection to this like beautiful ideation type work if it's not actually selling and not actually feeding back into your sustainability to do this work.
Right.
It's not a project.
Yeah,
it's a business.
Yeah, that's the piece.
Right?
Right? Needs to make money.
Exactly.
Right?
And
Otherwise
that's fueling.
Yeah. And it feels good.
The moment I knew that this was the path I was going to take was the first day I sold something. I will never forget that day. This lady wrote me on Facebook. It was my first collection. She's like, I want this skirt. I was like, okay, got her measurements. She came to my apartment. I had no studio, She tried it on in the bathroom. She came out. It fit perfectly. She was so thrilled. I was so thrilled. And then she gave me money. And I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, how can I do what I love and get paid?
How do we continue to do this?
Yeah, let me tell you something. The sky shifted in that moment.
Right.
Because all that time I was like, no, well, to be validated, I need to be a doctor. Like, the only way I'm going to make money is to do like this halfway kind of whatever on the side.
The hustle.
Nah.
Right.
When I sold that skirt, I was like, this is it.
This is what you want to do.
Yeah.
I mean, the Caribbean as a pipeline.
Yes.
Like, for me, it blows my mind. We did a fashion boot camp in New York about 5 years ago, and some people came from Trinidad for it, right? And the way that they were thinking and moving, and more importantly, their approach to getting the work done was on another level, right? Because, like, we know, because the conditions back home is different than America. You think America's so hard. No, it's not, right? And then you give someone opportunity, and they're soaking it all up, but then sometimes there's not a pipeline to go back and forth.
Yep.
So maybe speak to that piece, because there's only so many Anyas, there's only so many Dions, there's only so many of people who could come back and forth, and we need more of that to happen.
I really believe in the power of providing access.
Right.
And once you do, I mean, the talent is abounding,
Yes.
right? You market access in particular. I built this whole organization nudge off of market access. The way it works is that Massey Stores is the largest grocery retail footprint in the region. We put brands in Massey Stores just to get eyes on the product.
Right.
And it worked really well in the pandemic, obviously, because only the groceries are open, right? Those little tweaks, because you know, to get into a grocery, it's a whole set of things. Like, you can't possibly, as a small business, figure it out, right?
Absolutely.
So this simple act, revolutionary act of putting small Caribbean, authentically made in the Caribbean brands in the grocery, like, changed the trajectory of those businesses. And then we also added all the capacity building, funding, community support, all the things, because the one thing we knew for sure is that you can't just put them in the grocery and hope for the best. You actually have to help fill in all the gaps of the infrastructure for it to be sustainable. I'm not saying it's a magic bullet. Of the 200 brands we've onboarded, only 5 have been listed permanently in the grocery, right? It's not, the ROI isn't great, but it's starting to figure out the model of how do you, for instance, to your point, do the same thing but export, right? So if you say, for instance, through the types of brand partnerships that you guys have, you can say, okay, let's pluck out the best 5 designers from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, wherever, and let's put them in a space to be incubated, like what Foot Locker is doing with Lead, you know? That kind of model, to me, is incredibly powerful. Incredibly.
And then add the storytelling on piece of it.
Well,
right?
I mean,
because that's what they're naturally going to be able to do that we can't do.
1,000%.
Right.
Seeing the students who have had brand activated partnership opportunities because of the program, everybody wins, right? And like, that's the sort of thing that in the Caribbean I do over and over and over again, because when you storytell around it, all of a sudden becomes real. All of a sudden these are real people's lives with real impact. There, you know, there's one lady who lives in very sort of deep southwest Trinidad, called Mayaro, southeast, and like, she's now she's a queen in her community because she's in Massey stores. You know what I mean? These things have a ripple effect. Like, they may not always have immediate economic impact, but because she's now like this famous soap maker from a beach town in like rural Trinidad, how many more entrepreneurs are going to start to pop up because of that? You know,
they believe too, like they think it can happen.
Exactly.
Right.
So to me, it's like, it's a strategy around like the moonshot success stories that then influence and ripple out in communities on the ground in ways that you could never tangibly track, you know, but it happens. I know for a fact.
First of all, shout out to Adidas for even allowing us to do this and bring you in.
Yeah.
Because this is storytelling.
Absolutely.
Right? And a lot of times we look at the Addies and all these other brands product focused. But the truth is they can also help amplify the story because they're a marketing machine. So I just want to make sure I give some love to Addie, because even this conversation, a lot of people wouldn't even realize that A, who you are, B, the importance of creating a pipeline, not only just from Trinidad, but from the Caribbean, right? And how impactful that could be on both sides.
Once you crack that code for any sort of developing region, then it's a replicable model across all of them. The Caribbean has very similar challenges, lack of access to markets and opportunities that happen for MSMEs in Africa, that happen for the MSMEs in Southeast Asia. Like, it's a very like consistent pattern. So for me, it's like, okay, if you could figure out the framework, then you can copy paste it in many, many different parts of the world. This is not just about the Caribbean. This is about disenfranchisement that is systemic by design.
It's a proof of concept.
You know, if you can prove it, then it could be worked and scaled. You know?
I think we should prove it.
I think we should.
That's what we're getting at anyway. Go ahead, Lachey.
So I am curious, and I am going off the cuff a little bit, like, what inspires you, and truly, like, what is keeping you going?
I was speaking to Finuel yesterday. You know, she's a fashion designer from Grenada, and she was really clarifying for herself and I guess by mirroring to me that there's a truth in this, that this is not about us. And once you start to get too caught up in, you know, I can't do this, it's too much, it's unsustainable. I mean, you're human, right? When I'm reminded of that is I get refueled all over again. There's so many people who would die for the opportunities I've had. There's so many people who aspire to what I've been able to do, and I feel a duty to make that as easy and accessible as possible for people who, I mean, I'm a dual citizen, right? So that's helped tremendously. Like, I don't think twice about coming to the U.S. That is a huge
that's a big deal.
Right?
Yeah, it's
like
an unlock.
Every time I go in that separate line, I'm like, thank God. Like, because that alone has had a big impact. But that doesn't have to be the way. There are ways around that. But you have to advocate. Like, that's what I think my job is, in addition to showing up authentically. Because speaking up in rooms as myself with my accent and dressing the way I do and being this person, I think gives other people permission to do that too. And I've seen that happen. And I think the duty that I feel is on multiple levels. I just this morning rewatched the Super Bowl promo that Rihanna did. That was all shot in Barbados. With, like, you know, how she grew up wearing school uniforms and running around. And I'll never forget that piece, because it's moments like that, like choices that people make to represent themselves as themselves, and how many people like feel themselves in those moments, you know, and what that does for somebody. So those are the things that fuel me. I don't even have to think about it twice when that's where I'm coming from. And I think the power of the ripple effects of building platforms like I have with Nudge School, where eventually it starts to become not even my work. It becomes the people become ambassadors of the work on their own. You know, communities form, and the sort of self structuring and self management of the communities, it starts to take care of itself. You know, when I walk into school, half the time I'm like, I don't need to be here. It's all happening. You know, because they own it. It's their own thing. You know, so I think that from a business model perspective has been really powerful, because I can't do all of it, and I shouldn't. You know.
Just a follow-up question, as far as just for the aspiring fashion entrepreneurs, like, what advice would you give them?
Tell your story. Tell your true story. You know, authenticity is felt by your consumers, and it's not felt when it's the other way around. And people now especially buy based on what the part of you they think that they're buying. The product is just a facilitator of that, you know. And they buy from a place of truth and resonance. I, similarly to what we were saying earlier, that, you know, treat your business as a business and not a side thing, not a project. Projects start and stop, right? It's all well and good if you're like, oh, I'm just going to do a collection just for the sake of it, you know. But nobody wants to do that. So really taking it on as something that you know has to be sustainable, figuring out the business side of it by whatever means that is, whether it's Dion's in your life or your own efforts to know. It's crucial. And like Kendall said yesterday, let the market lead your choices, not the other way around. And I think building community is a priority, because I do think that we're in an age, as everyone says, community versus consumers. It's true. There is so much power in authentically connecting with people who, again, like they want a piece of you. Whatever they buy is really secondary. And there are other ways to monetize the building of a community. Like, I spent a lot of the pandemic delving into the world of Web3, understanding the power of digital fashion as an access point. That is almost entirely about community. And I've really done a lot in the space of using, like, superpowering product beyond the physical product, and figuring out how to monetize in that way too, you know. So I think the last thing would be, like, be extremely, if you're a creative already, right? Apply that creativity to how you're building this business and craft it to be exactly the version of it that you want.
Parallel to that advice question, because this is what I'm seeing so far. Like, there's a pocket of us now that started in creativity that are now going into creativity that's corporate. Right? So it's like you're giving advice to the people coming behind you, but then also in this new space that you've curated, because, like, we haven't talked about how many businesses that she's had, right? And still have. What advice would you give the evolution person who's like, damn, I used to create, but now I'm, like, in meetings with Target and I'm feeling weird about it, but, like, it's necessary. Because, like, the 19-year-old version of Dion, I can't always be that way. Right? So eventually I have to start evolving as well. And you've done that gracefully, right? So it's like, what advice would you give to that person as well?
It's a really timely moment you're asking me this, because the last 4 or 5 years, like I said, I've been partnered with Massey, as I mentioned, which is this, you know, big corporation. But I've also fundraised through development funding from many of the development banks in the Caribbean. And so having to figure out how to speak that language and translate the value of what I bring to the table, but into language that they get, has been a skill.
Yeah, it's a language, for sure.
It's like all well and good to, like, pontificate all day long about how important whatever it is I think I'm doing is. But if they're not reading it as value to them, it's falling on deaf ears, right? So that's been a real switch, and it feels powerful to speak a different language.
It is powerful, and as a woman too, right?
Yes.
Let's not forget that part.
1,000%. Like, I've had a gigantic shift in acknowledging the last couple of months alone, dealing with a transaction that I never knew I would ever have to do, far less know how to do.
Right.
And part of it is leaning into expertise that I don't have, making sure that I'm covered, in different areas, that legal, governance. Like, I've learned more about governance. I never knew the word governance. Now, like, I fully understand what it means,
Right. Right.
and the value of it, the value of having a board, the value of having, the type of structuring that gives you credibility, like, I can't I think I had a lot of disdain for the corporate world
Right.
before this.
Right.
And now I recognize the power of leveraging it. And you can't leverage it unless you're sitting at the table and learning the language and
Right.
being in it. Like,
Yeah.
now,
Right.
like, I can do this,
Yeah, no, for
and
sure.
that's extremely powerful.
And shout out to you for doing it, because
Yes.
like a lot of people bow out. Like, I'm just going to be creative. I don't want to learn that side. And they leave it alone, right? Where we had this conversation at our board meeting.
Yeah.
We need diversity in other sections now, right? Like, we can't all be vendors, right? We need someone to disrupt the boardroom. So that's why I asked the question, because there's a lot of people who are evolving as well.
Yeah.
And they're scared of it, because it's like starting all over again.
But at the same time, I've been scared of it. I mean, every time, for instance, I had to present to the board that was funding Nudge, oh my God, it was like a whole thing for me. I had like meditates and like all these things. Now I recognize that my voice is my actual voice. The
See
way
what I'm saying?
I see the way this could work
Right.
is incredibly valuable.
Right, right.
Because there's so much stasis, there's so much of the same, there's so much of archaic ways of the way these corporations
Operate.
work. And perspectives like ours are necessary, not just important, useful, no, necessary,
Yeah,
Right,
valuable.
right,
valuable,
right,
and crucial in this moment. Otherwise, the businesses are not going to work,
Right,
for
right.
much longer in the way they're going, So I
It's
think
crazy.
seeing the reframing of that is also important.
I'm kind of really excited to ask you this, because I know you personally, right? I started this question a long time ago. It's called Tunnel Talk. And how I came to it, I was watching something with Beyonce one time, and she went from behind the stage with Blue, like kissing her, loving her up, da-da-da-da, and then had to walk through a tunnel and smash the concert. And I'm always curious, like, what's your tunnel talk? Because I've actually seen you do it before. Where, like, me and her are chopping it up, she's with her kid, and she's like, hold on, Dion, I got to da-da-da-da. And then she's present in my conversation, and she'll give you a time, like, I only got 50 minutes because, like, I got to go back this way.
I know
Yeah.
you know what
Yeah.
it is.
Right.
I
But I always think that's amazing, because there's a conversation you have to have in your head to be able to go from A to B and then back to A again. So what's your tunnel talk, whether it's mom to stage or mom to fashion, design, corporate? I always just like to hear people's thought process when they're about to go through that tunnel.
Wow. I mean, moms know that is a moment-to-moment navigation.
Yeah.
Right.
Moments to moment. And you can't predict it, especially with young kids. There's no barrier to their need for you.
Right.
It really doesn't matter. You're talking to the CEO of whoever. They don't care.
Yeah, they don't care.
Thankfully, I think particularly through the pandemic, there's been a shift in what moms who work are expected to show up as. We had to force that. You're on Zoom and there's kids like running around in the background. Like, it is what it is now.
Right.
That facade is broken.
Yeah.
And then thankfully that's when I became a mom. So I didn't really have a lot of that pre-pandemic like stress.
Got you.
But I think similarly to how we were talking about how you show up in a boardroom as yourself and all those things, it's the same thing. It's like, I'm not hiding the fact that I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old and they're a priority.
Right.
That being said, like, they also need to know, like, this is what I'm doing in this moment.
Right.
I do think that things like meditation practice and knowing that being centered and present is a skill
Is it go?
that you nurture and you hone and refine. It doesn't just come,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really at the heart of being able to just one moment to the next, like, this is this, this is this, this is this, and they don't blend,
Right.
like,
Right.
and it's true. I go from being a creative in one to being like, having to figure out reading legal contracts to, leading a team, to empowering a team, to speaking to my childcare provider, like, in the space of 10 minutes.
Yeah, no. It's
So-
it's a serious skill. That's why I always ask the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you for honoring it.
Of course.
So lastly for me, because we talked about a lot and I love it, is there anything that you want to leave the audience with today that just we didn't talk about?
It's been really, really special being here at the Black Footwear Forum. I have felt a real sense of belonging in a way that a lot of events like this don't make you feel. And that has resonated with me living in the Caribbean and realizing that you have to create these spaces. They don't just happen by themselves. You have to bring people to the table that people aspire to become. And I think consistently putting myself in situations to carve that path so that, you know, someone said yesterday, you can't become what you haven't seen. And even if I've made it to certain spaces and been a certain amount of successful, like, I feel like it's only just begun. And I hope that moments like this continue, you know,
for sure,
because they fuel that. And so I really want to thank you.
No, for sure. I think we actually have to curate them more.
Yes.
Intentionally. Like, we have to have those conversations behind the scenes and put action to it.
Absolutely.
You know, and keep some of these brands accountable, because what they're very good at is telling the story and then falling short.
Yes.
But now I feel like the industry is in a different place where, like, all three of us sitting here right now, if we're having a real candid conversation and we collectively are speaking to a brand or period, a corporation, there's ways that we can make them move faster. We have the leverage, right? Because we're the culture. And now bringing in the Caribbean is a whole other vibe, because people don't realize, like, if you pepper all of America, we're everywhere, right? So it's like they look at it backwards, like, oh, it's Trinidad. What are we interested to do something over there for? But the truth is like, go to Brooklyn and say, where's the Caribbean? It is the Caribbean. It's just in Brooklyn, right? So it's just a matter
what's
of
the buying power,
right.
Because
Like, that's what I mean.
That this is not an emotional decision-making process.
It's not at all,
The data.
right? Right. And the storytelling is a tale. It's not only Labor Day weekend, you know? Like,
it's pervasive.
It should be year round, because there's so much stories to tell.
1,000%.
So I appreciate you. You know, I appreciate you pulling up, because I know it wasn't easy. You know, things change.
The kids weren't having it.
Right. But we figured it out. We figured it out. So I'm happy that you came.
Thank you.
Always peaceful, and happy that you always pull up whenever I hit you.
Thank you.
For sure. Of course.
We appreciate you. All right, guys, that's
There
it.
you go.
We appreciate you. Blacklights Podcast live on air. We'll see you next